Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for taking the time to testify today. Like Senator Scott, I have some serious concerns about mortgage servicing assets, but I understand that Ms. Rainey and Mr. Abernathy addressed those fully with Senator Scott. I just want to associate myself with his comments and with some of his concerns. I'd like to turn to a second topic, unrelated, about capital requirements and their impact on the global sanctions regime. Mr. Baer, you might be best situated to discuss this matter. Recently, Fed Governors Daniel Tarullo and Jerome Powell, in separate public comments, have said that the central bank would probably decide to require 8 of the largest U.S. banks to maintain more equity capital to pass the central bank's annual stress tests. Do you think the Federal Reserve has fully accounted for what higher capital requirements could mean for the United States' ability to enforce sanctions through the global financial system if large U.S.-based institutions are cutting operations or withdrawing from certain markets overseas because of the cost imposed by these new actions?
We at the Clearinghouse actually are quite focused on how effectual the AML-OFAC regime is currently. We have seen, I think, as you're alluding to, a large de-risking globally by U.S. and actually by U.K. and other banks as well, simply because if you do a risk and reward analysis, the risks of banking the wrong person under a strict liability sort of enforcement environment and where the penalties can be extraordinarily high can really never be recouped by anything you could charge a customer like that. There have been serious, I think, costs from that, including, we've talked to folks in the development area who believe that there are countries that need banking services around the world but are having U.S. and other banks withdraw from those services. We've heard from people in diplomacy and national defense expressing concerns about the ability of the U.S. to exert influence in those countries. And we've also heard from law enforcement and national security that it's a tough issue in the sense that you want to kick bad people out of the system, but you also want to observe bad people in the system. And so to the extent that U.S. banks are not doing that business abroad, that effectively blinds us to the ability to spot wrongdoing and potential terrorist financing, for example. I think capital could play a role in that, in the sense that, for example, a GSIB surcharge punishes cross-jurisdictional exposures. So one of the 5 factors that influence a large bank's charge is its dealings with those abroad, although that's really, I would confess, on the wholesale side, less on the retail side. Most of the largest banks aren't really doing much of a U.S., of a consumer retail business abroad. They're really managing their businesses through correspondent accounts. And so the de-risking that's taking place with the largest bank, that I think primarily is cutting off correspondents and large corporate borrowers. But again, that is having a whole host of, I think, unintended consequences. And I will give credit to the Treasury Department and others who I think are actually quite focused on this issue at this point.
So you do think that Treasury and some of the other agencies or departments in the government who might have a stake in this decision as it affects our ability to implement and enforce global sanctions are weighing in with the Federal Reserve?
I think they're weighing in. I think one of the core problems in this area, though, is sort of the incentives of those involved. For a bank regulatory agency, they are not sort of confronted day to day with concerns about development or national defense or diplomacy. I think they are, rightly worried, what will the reputational implications for the bank or for them be if the bank's the wrong person? So they have a very strong, one might say, perverse incentive to favor de-risking. That's why I think you saw this sort of unusual spectacle of the Secretary of State going over to London to lobby UK banks to continue banking Iranian accounts. And I think, whether you think they should or they shouldn't, the reason he was doing that was reflective of, the fact that banks are quite reluctant to do anything that might eventually result in a sanction for them.
I think they're understandably reluctant, and I think spectacle is an appropriate word to use for these circumstances. Would any of the other panelists care to weigh in? I know that may be a little outside your bailiwick, but would be happy to hear from you as well.
Certainly, Senator, if I could just briefly and certainly echo what Mr. Baer has said. One of the biggest challenges we have as a bank, one of these causes of de-risking, is not only are banks required to understand their customers, but now they're being required by rules to take on responsibility for their customer's customer, based upon information that they really don't have access to, and yet they get sanctioned for what a customer's customer is doing. And that's causing a number of banks to say, I just don't make enough money in this line of business to be able to carry that huge regulatory risk, and so I'm just getting out of this business. That affects banks of all sizes, and it affects not only international, but domestic as well.
Thank you all.